WBUR Podcasts, Boston.
I'm Darryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. Boston City Council has unanimously approved a task force to explore the issue of reparations for Black Bostonians. And I would say that's a pretty big deal. So I'm here with Masslive reporting fellow Alvin Buyinza, who covered the historic vote, and he's here to discuss with us what the task force will look like and the actual task that lies ahead. Alvin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Darryl.
All right, so my very first question is, when do the checks go out? I'm just kidding. Don't answer that. But seriously, though, it's so nice to talk to you about this because, one of the first stories I did for WBUR was about Boston being among the cities to take on reparations. And now, here we are having this conversation. So this is pretty cool. So as I stated before, the city councilors, they voted unanimously to create this task force. Before we get into the details, just give us a little background on this decision.
It was first proposed in February by Councilor at Large Julia Mejia. Then a couple months down the line, in June, the city council voted on a resolution proposed by Tanya Ferguson Anderson, which stated that the city must form a formal apology for its role in slavery. And now in December 14th, the Boston City Council voted to form a 15-member task force to study reparations in the city. 5 of these members, the ordinance states, must be people who have ancestors who were enslaved Africans.
So do they have any idea of who exactly would be on the task force?
It consists of representatives from the NAACP Boston, New Democracy Coalition King Boston, UMass Boston Africana Studies Department, the UN Centro Diaspora Afro, and there are 10 members from a pool of applicants that were recommended by current commissioners.
Okay. Now, take us back to the meeting where the councilors voted. What happened there?
The meeting was really interesting because what we saw was almost every single member of the Boston City Council speaking on why this was so important, what was historical and groundbreaking about this decision, and talking about a call to action and saying, we really need to, as a city, start taking the bull by the horns. What is a tangible way we can provide equity to the most marginalized group in this city, which is Black Bostonians? Let's push ourselves further than the apology and the symbolism. Let's go in and say, what is something that is going to economically mobilize and give greater access and opportunities to Black people living in Boston? One of the quotes that I love that Fernandez Anderson said, "We are a rich city and one of the richest in the country. We have hospitals, universities, and museums that are worth millions and millions of dollars and that have grown rich from the labor of Black people, both paid and unpaid. They need to be a part of this process." It is a very wealthy city, but it just didn't get wealthy overnight. Its wealth is rooted within the oppression of Black people, the enslavement, the chattel slavery system. It's rooted in that. It's rooted in the fact that there are Black people who have lived their entire lives in the city, and yet they're struggling to get by paycheck to paycheck to live here. They may not be able to send their children to the best schools. They may not be able to get the best access to healthcare, but they have ancestors who literally built this city that is giving the greatest amount of access and opportunities to wealthy white Americans. And she's saying, if this is really a great city in one of the richest cities, then it needs to be able to give something back to the people who built it. They need to be able to be given something that can generate large amounts of equity for them, that can give them the access, the opportunities, the economic mobilization they need to live, not just survive, but to live in this city. And so every single person, almost every single counselor, kind of spoke around something around this. They talked about how important this was to Black Bostonians, that we're finally getting, in the weeds and saying, hey, let's now start giving something back to Black people in Boston. What do they need? Let's push beyond the symbolism and let's start really doing something tangible.
Yeah, and I think, when I'm listening to you talk, I'm reminded that, Black people have been in Boston for centuries, like, since the 1600s, you know what I mean? And so when you think about those structural inequities, it's like you are denying Bostonians their right to a good livelihood. Do they have any idea of where that work begins for the task force? Like, give me an example of what that looks like specifically.
So according to Councilor Ricardo Arroyo, there's going to be 3 phases of this task force. The first phase would be to research and document Boston's role in the African slave trade. Phase 2 would be to assess Boston's actions to date to address the continued impact of slavery. And then finally, they would make recommendations to the city for, quote, truth, reconciliation, and reparations for its role in the slave trade. The task force, some of its responsibilities include, defining what reparations means in terms of the Boston community, collecting data around historic harms, in education, development, economic areas, housing, health. I know in the ordinance, one of the things that was cited was the 2015 Color of Wealth in Boston report from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. And according to the report, it says the median wealth of white families in the city was $247,500, but the median wealth for Black families was only $8. I think the task force is really going to start getting into the weeds of figuring out what are we first dealing with? Where are the gaps? And then, like good doctors going in and saying, okay, here are the recommendations. Here are some of the treatments we can do.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more on Boston's Reparations Task Force.
Politics has never been stranger or more online, which is why the politics team at Wired is making a new show, Wired Politics Lab. It's all about how to navigate the endless stream of news and information and what to look out for. Each week on the show, we'll dig into far-right platforms, AI chatbots, influencer campaigns, and so much more. Wired Politics Lab launches Thursday, April 11th. Follow the show wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're back. Is this the first time reparations has been brought up at this level for the city of Boston, or just be it at the local level or at the state level? Is this the first time folks are having this discussion in those spaces?
So, no, it is not. Through the meeting, the famous person who was really, really cited was the late Senator Bill Owens. He was a Democrat and he was Massachusetts' first Black senator, which is groundbreaking. And he was credited for essentially initiating the conversation on reparations in the state. Senator Bill Owens was really famous for his late 1980s bill, that would have required state governments to pay reparations to Massachusetts descendants of enslaved Black Americans. So they really did credit Senator Bill Owens.
Got it. And, reparations is a pretty radical idea for a lot of people.
Yes.
Even in some of the most liberal spaces where there's a lot of tolerance, but when you dig deep, you start to see some systemic problems that need to be addressed. And discussing those things and talking about what it takes to correct those things, it gets kind of touchy for some people because That's where the real work is. So I'm curious to know, has there been any sort of pushback?
So I don't think there were any people who reluctantly voted against it. Once again, this was a unanimous vote.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you do watch the city council meeting, if you did watch, there was a moment where a comment was brought up. I'm supportive of a task force to study reparations. Mm-hmm. But let me point out that Massachusetts was the first state to ban slavery. And there's kind of an issue with saying that because it's like trying to reward a state.
Patting yourself on the back for doing the bare minimum.
For doing the bare minimum. And second of all, what is the goal of saying that? What is the point of saying that? Okay, Massachusetts was the first state to ban slavery. Okay, but you know what? Boston in Massachusetts in general is still very, very, very unequal. And it is still, I would say, just like the rest of this country, is really not doing a great job in providing equitable opportunities for African Americans.
Understood. Alvin, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us. This is a topic I'm really interested in because, it's not so much of, what there is for Black folks to gain, but just the fact that we're having the conversation and these type of laws and policies and things are being discussed, it's really interesting to me. It's really something. So there's definitely a lot to critique and there's a lot to talk about, but, I do see it as a step in the right direction. So thank you for coming by and talking to us about this. It was truly a pleasure.
Thank you for having me, Darryl.
That's Masslive reporting fellow Alvin Buyinza. And that's our show for today. Thanks so much for listening to The Common, and please hit us up on Instagram or Twitter at WBURTheCommon, or send us an email at thecommon@wbur.org. I'm Darryl C. Murphy, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.